He was never like this. I'm shocked. I would never picture in my right mind he would ever do something to a family. I'm just devastated.
Merry Christmas to me and just kept walking down this way, and that was it.
We're in a world where we constantly experience the fickleness of human existence. 1 minute, you're having the time of your life with your loved ones around you, and the next, they're yelling for help, stretching out their bloodied hands for you to take, but you can't take them because your life is also flashing before your eyes at that moment. It's not a movie, but it's the most horrific thing you've ever witnessed. This story that is about to be told mirrors pain, torment, and torture. Imagine a Christmas party with loved ones gathered together, celebrating the holiday season. But in an instant, the joy and laughter turned to horror and tragedy. On December 24, 2008, the Covina massacre shook the small town of Covina, California, leaving 9 people dead and a community in shock. Gunshots rang out, and a devastating arson fire filled the home, trapping victims inside. The party turned into a horrible dream. Many people got hurt, and many questions were left unanswered. It was a very sad and scary moment. But what led to this unspeakable act of violence? The Covina massacre remains a haunting reminder that even in the most joyful of times, darkness can strike without warning. The Ortega family was having a great time together in their Covina home on Christmas Eve. In the dining room, Papa Joe Ortega, his wife of 53 years, and their children were playing a late-night game of Texas Hold'em. They had just finished dinner and were enjoying each other's company. The grandchildren were in the backyard, playing video games and hanging out near the pool. They were having so much fun that they didn't want the night to end. Meanwhile, upstairs, the Ortega's 17-year-old grandson, Michael, was sitting at his computer, typing away. It was a peaceful and happy moment, with everyone doing something they enjoyed. But little did they know, this peaceful night was about to turn into a horror movie. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. The 8-year-old girl was so excited, she squealed with delight. "Santa Claus! Santa Claus!" A man dressed as Santa Claus walked in, pulled out a gun, and shot the little girl right in the face. 2 of her uncles tried to protect her, but they were also shot and fell to the ground. The rest of the family, including the Ortegas and 3 of their daughters, tried to hide under the dining table. But it was too late. The gunman, who was the ex-husband of one of the daughters, was unstoppable. The fire started by a flamethrower device was incredibly intense, causing a massive explosion that sent flames shooting up into the air. The flames were as high as 40 to 50 feet. It was a huge blaze that required a lot of manpower to put out. In fact, it took a team of 80 firefighters over an hour and a half to finally extinguish the fire. Can you imagine how dangerous and scary it must have been for the people in the house and the firefighters who were trying to save them? The fire was so intense that it made it really hard to identify the victims. The flames were so strong that they damaged the bodies, making it impossible to recognize them. So, the investigators had to use other methods to figure out who was who. They used dental records like X-rays of teeth and medical records like scars or other unique features to identify the victims. It was a challenging task, but they were able to use these clues to piece together who was there that tragic night. The Ortega family's worst fears came true that night. The gunman, Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, was relentless. He killed Papa Joe and his wife, 4 of their children, 2 daughters-in-law, and even the 17-year-old grandson who was innocently sitting at his computer. No one was spared. The entire family, who had been enjoying a happy Christmas Eve just moments before, was brutally murdered. There were around 25 to 30 people celebrating Christmas Eve with the Ortega family. But after the tragedy, the survivors didn't want to talk about it publicly. However, some people working on the investigation shared information that matched what the family members said. This information helps us understand what happened inside the house. The family members described a very scary scene. A man with a gun wanted to hurt and kill people. The family members tried to run away and save their loved ones, but it was very hard because everyone was so scared and confused. When Bruce got to the party, a lot of the grown-ups were near the front door because some people were getting ready to leave. This made them easy targets when the attack started. Family members said that Charles, one of the Ortega sons, saw who the gunman was after he shot Charles's little niece, who was only 8 years old, and his big brother, James. Someone yelled out, "It's Bruce!" Charles was shot right after James was. It was a really scary and dangerous situation, and everyone was trying to get away from the gunman. Irma Chapa Ortega, a close family member, shared a heartbreaking detail about the tragedy. She said that James and Charles Ortega, despite being wounded, tried to get up and stop the gunman. They were badly hurt, but they still tried to stand up and grab him. Unfortunately, they couldn't. Irma also said that the older Ortegas, Joseph and Alicia, and their 3 daughters, along with one of their daughters-in-law, Teresa, hid under the dining room table. She had been in touch with some of the family members who survived the attack, and they shared these details with her. Someone yelled out, "Run! Run!" and chaos erupted. The Ortegas and 2 of their daughters, Sylvia and Alicia, might have been killed while they were still in the dining room, but their daughter Letitia, whose little girl was badly hurt, managed to survive. Letitia had hidden under the table for a short time. She called 911 and told the police dispatcher, "I heard the shots and everyone started panicking and running. Everyone started panicking and running, and we all dove under the dining room table."
Shooting. He's shooting. What's your address? Ma'am, I understand. I need to know your address.
When he shot, I heard the shots and they were like poppers and I wasn't sure what it was, so everyone started panicking and running, so we all dove under the dining room. Some of us dove, some of us left.
Chapa shared a heroic story about her cousin Letitia. She said Letitia saw her hurt daughter stumbling out of the house and decided to make a run for it. A person close to the investigation said that even though the gunman shot the little girl in the face, she might have saved her own life by turning her head at the last second. The bullet hit her jaw, but luckily didn't kill her. The person who gave this detail didn't want to be named because the police were still investigating what happened. After this happened, Letitia screamed at the dispatcher, "I need someone to come over and help my daughter. She's bleeding. She's been shot in the face." Some of the adults quickly grabbed the kids and carried them to safety. The investigators think that most of the young people were saved because they were in the back of the house, near the TV, probably playing video games, when the gunman started shooting. The 8-year-old girl was hurt, and a 16-year-old girl was shot in the back, but luckily, they survived. The only young person who didn't make it was Michael Ortiz, a 17-year-old who was sitting at the computer upstairs. Chapa said that Michael was probably killed by the explosion or fire that started when the gunman used a homemade device made from 2 tanks to set the house on fire. A law enforcement source said it appears that Michael was killed as a result of the fire or explosion and was not shot. It's a tragedy that a young life was lost in such a senseless act of violence. Michael Ortiz's mother, Alicia, was also killed. But why did the murderer commit such a brutal act of violence? Bruce, a 45-year-old man, was very angry about his marriage ending. He and his wife had just gotten divorced, and he was consumed by hurt and anger. Instead of dealing with his emotions in a healthy way, he decided to take revenge on her and her family. He chose a tragic and devastating way to do it, by attacking them at their annual Christmas party in Covina, California. A team of FBI experts studied Bruce's behavior and found that he had some mental health issues, including extreme narcissism and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Although it's no excuse or justification, these conditions likely contributed to his decision to commit such a horrific act. It's heartbreaking that a family's joyous celebration turned into a tragedy because of one person's anger and sickness. Bruce had a plan to escape after his attack on the Ortega family. He had even bought a plane ticket to Illinois, thinking he could just leave the chaos behind and start fresh. But his plan didn't work out as he expected. When he set the house on fire, he he badly burned himself. He suffered second and third-degree burns on his arms, which are very painful and serious injuries. So instead of escaping, he was left with severe burns. It's amazing how his plan backfired and led to his own suffering.
You know, when I first heard it, I knew he was wearing a Santa suit, and I knew who he was because I had seen him, but more than one time. So, but I didn't think anything of it until they were saying that he used the Santa suit and he put stuff in the Santa suit, like guns and whatever he used. And then it kind of freaked me out, thinking that maybe he had already planned this for a long time. And like I say, he stopped here. He ushered at the church across the street. He stopped here a couple of times and knocked on the door and said, "Hi, how are you? How's your dog?" And "Mine's fine," you know, and da-da-da. And, you know, just nice guy.
After his failed attempt at escape, Bruce drove 40 miles to his brother's house in Sylmar. He went there to end his own life. Lieutenant Fred Corral from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office shared that Bruce had a wound on the top of his head, which suggests that he put the gun in his mouth before pulling the trigger. A toxicology test had to be taken on Bruce, and it was said to have taken up to 6 weeks to get the result. This test would show if Bruce had any drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of his death. When the police searched Bruce's body, they found something strange. He had wrapped $17,000 in cash around his legs with plastic wrap and was wearing a special underwear called a girdle to keep it in place. They also found his rental car parked a block away from his brother's house. But when they tried to move the car, they realized it was rigged with a dangerous device that would explode if they touched it. The police had to be very careful. Inside his brother's house, they found 4 empty handguns and a lot of bullets, over 200 rounds. They also found some leftover pieces from his Santa suit that were rigged to explode. Back at Bruce's own house in Montrose, California, the police found even more dangerous things. They found empty boxes that had held semi-automatic handguns, a special kind of shotgun called a Benelli M2 Tactical, and a container for a type of gasoline that was highly flammable. But what was most shocking was what they called a virtual bomb factory in his home. It was like a secret workshop where he had been making dangerous devices. It's lucky the police were able to find all of this before anyone else got hurt. On the outside, Bruce Pardo seemed like a really charming and generous person. He was the kind of person who could light up a room with his smile and make everyone feel welcome. But on the inside, he was hiding some serious problems. His marriage was falling apart, and it was causing him a lot of pain. But he didn't show any of this to the people around him. Even the people who knew him best had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. They didn't know that long before his divorce was finalized, Bruce had started secretly collecting weapons and planning an elaborate escape plan. He was living a double life, and no one suspected a thing. In 2004, Bruce Pardo met Sylvia Orza. They were introduced by her brother-in-law, who worked with Bruce at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Sylvia was 40 years old and had 3 kids from 2 previous marriages. Bruce's friends thought she was perfect for him, a kind and practical woman with a big family. They thought she could help him settle down and be happy. And for a while, it seemed like they were right. Bruce and Sylvia got married and started a new life together. At first, Pardo was drawn to his wife's warm and welcoming family, but after the first year of their marriage, she told friends, he had become cold, miserable, and distant. They often argued about money. In March 2008, Bruce and Sylvia decided to separate. Sylvia asked Bruce if she could stay in their home until her daughter finished kindergarten, but Bruce wasn't having it. While Sylvia was out at a family gathering, Bruce packed up all her stuff and left it on the driveway. Sylvia was devastated. She had to move in with her sister in Glendale and eventually filed for divorce. Bruce went to Gun World in Burbank on June 13th and bought a handgun for almost $1,000 cash. He got fired on July 31st for fraud and tried to get unemployment benefits, but couldn't get them. He went back to Gun World on August 8th and bought another handgun. He kept coming back to the store, buying a total of 5 handguns. He also ordered a Santa suit from a costume store, saying it was for a kid's party. He paid a $200 deposit and promised to pick it up in November. Bruce also went to a gun shop in Iowa and bought 16 magazines that can hold 18 bullets each, way more than California laws allow. And, just a week before Christmas, his marriage to Sylvia was officially over. They had been having too many problems and couldn't fix them, so the judge ended their marriage in a courthouse in Burbank. Just before Christmas, Bruce Pardo rented 2 cars, a Dodge and a Toyota. He packed the Toyota with all sorts of stuff like maps, water, food, clothes, and a can of gasoline. He also put in 2 computers. Later that night, his neighbor Bong Garcia saw him leaving in the Dodge, which was weird because he usually drove his fancy Escalade or Hummer. Bruce said he was off to a Christmas party, but Bong thought it was strange. He had gone to carry out his revenge. After he set the house on fire, as the house burned, a neighbor saw a blue car drive away with its headlights off. A pair of fake glasses and Santa's hat had been dropped in the front yard. Bruce drove to his brother's house in Sylmar, 40 miles away. He was badly burned, with severe injuries on his arms, hands, neck, and legs. His Santa suit had melted into his skin. He was in a terrible state and couldn't escape anymore. When his brother got home at 3:10 a.m., he found Bruce's body on the couch, with 2 guns next to him. He had shot himself in the mouth. He was still wearing his wedding ring. Letitia Józef-Polsky is a strong woman who chooses not to let anger and hate consume her. She says, "I can't do anything to change what happened. I can only focus on what's brought to me and the good things that are brought to me. I appreciate that." She's grateful for the love and support she's received from people she didn't even know. This gratitude has helped her heal and find peace. Letitia has also stopped dwelling on the past and the person who hurt her family. She says, "This is what he's done. Enough. I'm not going to allow you to consume us with your evilness." Instead, she chooses love and encourages others to do the same. Letitia believes love is the strongest energy and that it can bring people together and help them heal. She also thinks it's important to teach our children about love and kindness so they can grow up to be good examples for others. She says, "Our kids are our future, and we have to be an example for them. If we teach them that it's okay to hate, it's okay to be violent, and it's okay to put our people down and make them feel less than, then what hope do we have?" 12 years have passed, and Letitia and Katrina Józef-Polsky are working hard to keep their family's traditions and happy memories alive. The family still gets together for dinner, exchanges gifts, and shares stories about their loved ones who are no longer with them. On Christmas Eve, they visit the cemetery where their family members are buried instead of going to church. One of the nephews, who lost both his parents in the tragedy, has become the guardian of his 3 younger siblings. Letitia and her husband took in her sister's youngest daughter, and Letitia worked hard to make sure the surviving kids still had a sense of Christmas. She told them that the Santa who came that night wasn't the real one. The kids even went to a special camp to help them deal with their grief and trauma. Letitia says, "No matter where you look, there are memories of what we used to have, and then memories of that terrible night. You can't escape it. But even with all the pain, Letitia knows that Christmas will always be special, and they will keep celebrating no matter what." Even though the investigation ended almost 10 years ago, the detectives who helped the family still keep in touch, especially around Christmas. They care about the family and want to make sure they're doing okay.
"No, we love you. You don't have to do this." "I'm sorry, Erica. I shot her first so that she wouldn't have to watch her children die."
On December 26, 2007, Linda Thiele went to the home of her best friend, 61-year-old Judy Anderson, only to find her entire family, including 2 children aged 5 and 3, brutally slain. The crime shocked the tiny town of Carnation, Washington, whose 2,000 or so inhabitants had never seen such violence before. Curiously, the only member of the Anderson family to survive was Michelle Anderson, who was living with her boyfriend Joseph McEnroe at the time.
911. I've been to Margaret.
1806, 1044, there's two people that I can see right now. And I just came up, she works with me. And talking about? Yeah. Okay. What's your last name? My name is Hieley, Hieley. I work for the Carnation Post Office. Okay, what's your first name? Linda. What do you see? Oh, God, there's in the other room. There's a baby and a man and a woman. And she's my best friend. You get to ride there? Yes, I had to walk in the block from the driveway.
In a small town like Carnation, people tend to be closely involved in each other's lives. Based on witness accounts, the Andersons seemed like a normal family, for the most part. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, the head of the household, had a well-paying job as an engineer at Boeing, and his wife Judy worked at the local post office. This is where she met and became friends with Linda, who seems to have been close to the entire family. Wayne and Judy had two children, 32-year-old Scott and 29-year-old Michelle. While most parents wouldn't say they preferred either of their children, at least out loud, it appears that the Andersons clearly loved their son more than their daughter. Or at the very least, Scott hadn't made nearly as many bad decisions as his little sister, and this might have created resentment between them. Michelle Anderson seems to have been the black sheep of the family. It's very likely that she had trouble relating to others and taking care of herself, whereas Scott ended up getting married and settling down fairly quickly. He had two children over the next few years, Olivia and Nathan, who were 5 and 3 respectively at the time of the incident. His wife, 32-year-old Erica, was very close to Scott's parents. They seemed to have had a good relationship, and perhaps Anderson resented the fact that her mother and father preferred their daughter-in-law to her. But there's a good chance that the Andersons were frustrated by their daughter's inability to grow up. While Scott started raising and supporting his own family, Michelle lived rent-free in a trailer on some rural property owned by her parents and located some 200 yards away from their residence. She had a job at Target, and instead of finding a supportive partner like Scott did, she ended up with an unemployed deadbeat by the name of Joseph McEnroe. McEnroe hailed from Santa Clara, California. His relatives described him as eager to please and a hardcore video game lover. He'd been a good kid by all accounts, but much like Michelle, he didn't really know how to get settled in life. However, it's been said that he wasn't a violent person. He was someone that just liked to be left alone, and his relatives would later express shock at the violence he'd committed with Anderson. But beneath the seemingly gentle surface, McEnroe experienced enormous anxiety. He was also quite gullible, and sometimes struggled to discern right from wrong. This made him especially susceptible to manipulation, which might be why Michelle wanted to date him in the first place. The pair met on a dating app in 2001 and had had a toxic, codependent relationship ever since. Their personal issues were made worse by their inability to manage their finances. Life was not easy for Anderson and McEnroe. Their trailer was run down, and they didn't have many future prospects. Based on reports, McEnroe never really tried to find a job, and if by some miracle he got employed, he couldn't make it last very long. Money was constantly a problem in their fragile household. This contrasted greatly with the well-to-do Andersons, with Wayne and Judy both earning good money, but Michelle felt like they didn't do enough to help her. In her view, they owed her a lot for bringing her into this world, but that's definitely not how Wayne and Judy saw it. After allowing their daughter to stay on the property free of charge for quite some time, they told her that they'd start charging rent. This infuriated Anderson, who believed that she was being treated unfairly and that her parents were just being greedy. On top of that, Anderson also alleged that her brother kept borrowing money from her. According to her, Scott racked up a debt of about $40,000 over the years, and no matter how many times she asked, he refused to pay her back. Anderson's frustration began to mount, and she wanted to do something drastic. She talked to McEnroe, and the pair came up with a bizarre plan. They decided that if Wayne and Judy weren't going to change their tune, they might need to be taken out of the picture entirely. Anderson and McEnroe were completely committed to each other. They even wanted to go to Las Vegas and get married, but first they felt like they needed to settle their account with Wayne and Judy. It turned out that McEnroe had bought 2 firearms in the summer of 2006, a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. On Christmas Eve, 2007, they headed to Wayne and Judy's residence with a lethal plan in mind. Judy and Wayne were busy preparing for a Christmas Eve celebration. According to reports, Judy was in the back room wrapping Christmas presents for her grandkids. McEnroe distracted her with a gun hidden in his belt, while Anderson headed for her father, the second weapon in hand. She pointed the gun at Wayne and pulled the trigger, but the poorly formed plan started to unravel from the start. The first domino to fall was Anderson's gun, which jammed as she attempted to fire it. Realizing something was wrong, McEnroe went to the other room and shot him in the head. Judy heard the gunfire and ran into the room, only for McEnroe to mow her down with more bullets. She fell to the floor screaming, and McEnroe apologized to her before pressing the gun against her head and pulling the trigger. With the parents now dead, it's possible that Anderson and McEnroe started to realize how likely their plan was to fail. Even so, they'd gone too far to turn back now. Knowing that Scott, Erica, and the kids were going to arrive any minute, they decided to clean up the crime scene. First, they dragged Wayne and Judy's corpses to a nearby storage shed, after which they tried to remove any trace of blood from the scene. Using towels and chemical cleaners, Anderson and McEnroe managed to make the place spotless, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. 45 minutes after his parents were gunned down, Scott arrived at the residence with his wife and children. As soon as he stepped in through the front door, he saw his sister waiting to greet him. He realized what was happening when she pulled out her firearm and charged at her in a brave attempt to save his family. Unfortunately, Anderson was able to fire 4 shots directly at Scott as he rushed towards her. One of the bullets punctured his neck, ending his life instantly. Erica was also shot twice in the barrage of bullets, but she managed to hold on. She knew that she had to do something, anything, to put this horrific incident to an end. That's when she noticed a cordless phone nearby. Also, if you're into true crime, I drop videos about fresh cases daily, so hit that subscribe button to stay in the loop and support the channel. Erica was on the floor bleeding out, but she mustered up all her strength and crawled over a sofa to take cover. The phone was right beside her, so she picked it up and called emergency services. She was only able to stay on the line for a few seconds before McEnroe arrived to take the phone away.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
The operator wasn't able to get any information from the call, but she noticed raised voices in the background. She assumed that someone was having a party where things were getting a bit rowdy, and decided to dispatch 2 officers to the scene, just to be sure. While the officers got on their way, McEnroe grabbed the phone from Erica's hands, ripped out the batteries, and crushed it with his feet. He later testified that Erica was pleading with him the whole time, potentially even screaming at him to not hurt the children. All McEnroe could do was apologize. In fact, he apologized constantly throughout the whole ordeal, but that didn't stop him from finishing the job. He fired a bullet into Erica's head, effectively eliminating the second generation of the Anderson family outside of Michelle. But there was still the third generation to consider. You might think that these 2 cold-blooded culprits wouldn't be able to hurt 2 children aged 5 and 3, but you'd be wrong. Anderson looked at her niece and nephew and realized that they were a liability. She knew that they couldn't allow them to survive, and became paranoid that they would become witnesses in a potential trial. In other words, Anderson wanted them dead, but she couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. Instead, she turned to McEnroe, who was likely horrified at the suggestion, but even he could see the truth in what she was saying. The 2 culprits rationalized for a while, saying that the children would be scarred for life anyway, and that it was kinder to put them out of their misery. McEnroe took Olivia's life first, once again apologizing before shooting her in the head. He then looked up to see 3-year-old Nathan, who'd picked up the batteries from the cordless phone off the floor. He was playing with the batteries while McEnroe looked down on him, and the shooter later stated that the child looked at him with complete comprehension, as if he knew exactly what was going on. This seems to suggest that McEnroe had completely broken from reality by this point. He no longer saw an innocent child. Perhaps this was a way for him to avoid feeling any guilt for what he was about to do next, which in turn may have made it easier to shoot Nathan in the head, just like his grandparents and sister. The deed was done, but then Anderson realized that Erica's 911 call had gone through. She knew that police would be arriving to investigate the call, so she headed out to the dirt road leading up to the house and locked the front gate on the other end. Moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived to look into the call. When they found the gate locked and heard no signs of a disturbance, they asked a neighbor who apparently hadn't heard anything suspicious either. The deputies then left the scene without investigating any further. Anderson and McEnroe knew they'd passed the point of no return. They were the only survivors of a 6-person massacre despite living just 200 yards away. The police would identify them as persons of interest right away and eventually suspect them of committing this act. They'd be interviewed, and at some point, they wouldn't be able to hide the truth any longer. Realizing all of this, or perhaps not really thinking at all, Anderson and McEnroe made for the Canadian border. At some point during their journey, they realized that escaping to Canada might not be the best option, so they decided to go to Oregon instead. This meant that they'd pass by Wayne and Judy's property, and they may have been tempted to see the aftermath of their actions. Back in Carnation, Linda Thiele arrived at the post office on December 26th and noticed that her best friend Judy wasn't there. This was extremely unusual. Judy was always on time, and she rarely ever took sick days. That afternoon, she headed to Judy's house to check up on her. When she looked in through the window, she saw 2 corpses lying on the ground. These bodies were Scott and Erica, but Linda thought they were Wayne and Judy at first. She had no idea that everyone had been shot, and so she assumed that they'd tragically died from carbon monoxide poisoning. It's only when she entered the home that she saw the brutal violence of the scene. Understandably distraught, Linda called the police and told them everything that she saw.
There's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now. I'll just tell you about she works with there's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend. And it is locked, which makes me wonder if her daughter did it. Which is scary, because then I might be up here with a murderer.
Linda had noticed the closed outside gate, and she immediately started suspecting the daughter as the culprit. Police started swarming the scene and set up a perimeter, and at this exact moment, Anderson and McEnroe drove by on their way to Oregon. They stopped at the house, got out of the car, and were immediately brought in for questioning by the police. Anderson and McEnroe tried to lie at first, claiming that they were heading to Las Vegas to get married. However, the guilt of what they'd done was too much to bear. Eventually, Anderson confessed to their actions. While breaking down into sobs, she told the detective everything.
Michelle, I know you're sorry. No one's saying you are a bad person. But we what happened? Michelle, the only thing I know is what you told me. So tell me what happened. Oh, that was true. I know, but tell me what happened at your parents' house.
McEnroe still maintained his innocence, but he and Anderson were both charged with 6 counts of homicide in the first degree. While in custody, Anderson expressed remorse and said that she was a monster that deserved the death penalty. As it turned out, that's exactly the sentence that prosecutors wanted as well. However, this death sentence was simply not meant to pass. On January 31, 2013, Judge Jeffrey said that execution was off the table based on the evidence provided by the prosecution, but the trial continued. Prosecutors continued to push for the death penalty, and the judge made an amendment to his prior statement. He said that if McEnroe were to confess to the murders, his maximum sentence would be bumped down to life without parole. Realizing that he had no other options left, McEnroe finally pleaded guilty. His defense argued that Anderson controlled his every action and was the true mastermind of the plan. But McEnroe's appearance in court ruined any chances he had of reducing his sentence.
I'm sorry. I'm terrible.
McEnroe immediately admitted to the Christmas Eve killing 7 years ago, his attorney asking why he would do something so diabolical.
I'm sorry, I did because I thought I had to. And yeah, I know that's not a very good excuse, but I'm not trying to excuse myself. I'm just trying to explain my actions. I've also taken from them from these people who had done nothing but shown me kindness and goodness, and if I thought that holding myself or killing myself or doing anything, that anything I could do would go off and bring back these people or ameliorate the pain or something, I would.
The fact that McEnroe laughed on the stand definitely worked against him, although it bears mentioning that he was heavily medicated at the time. Regardless, he seemed to treat his violence as a joke at first, but later started to realize the gravity of his actions. His accent also appears to shift as he talks, veering into a vaguely British accent with dropped R's, suggesting the presence of some kind of personality disorder. Was McEnroe just a sick individual who had no idea what he'd done? Maybe, maybe not, but his behavior in court certainly showed that he was a threat to himself and others.
See the emptiness, well, she should be.
Convicted killer Joseph McEnroe broke down, grabbed his head, and cried.
Then she wasn't moving anymore, and so I went over by where she was and I told her that I was sorry, and I shot her in the head.
On March 25, 2015, McEnroe was declared guilty on all counts. He was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With Anderson's trial looming around the corner, all eyes were on her to see if she'd get a similar sentence. Her trial began on January 25, 2016. In his opening statements, Deputy Prosecutor Scott O'Toole laid out the events that had occurred on the day of the incident.
Members of the jury, on December 24th, 2007, Christmas Eve, more than 8 years ago, two people, this woman, Michelle Anderson, and her boyfriend, a person by the name of Joe McEnroe, walked out of that mobile home that's about halfway up that driveway on the left. They got into their truck and they drove up to the main house. They parked that truck, they walked up onto the porch, and they went through the front door. Members of the jury, nobody lives in that home anymore. Michelle Anderson and her boyfriend stayed but a few hours, a very short time indeed. But when they were done, a family that had lived in that home for 30 years lay dead. 6 people. 2 grandparents, their son and daughter-in-law, and their 2 grandchildren.
This set the stage for a compelling case against Michelle. That, coupled with the evidence and compounded by her tearful confession, gave the jury all of the information they needed. On March 4th, 2016, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted on all counts of aggravated homicide in the first degree. And so, a year after her boyfriend was sentenced, and 8 years after slaying her entire family, Anderson was sent to jail. She's currently imprisoned in the Washington Correction Center for Women, with McEnroe being sent to Washington State Penitentiary. Due to the strict rules around inmate communications, they've likely had no contact with each other for years. All they really have is the horrific memory of the slayings, which likely replay in their minds every night. There's no one left to mourn the Andersons, save for the people that took their lives and the few friends they left behind. One of them, Linda Thiele, had to re-experience her trauma multiple times during the trial, ensuring that the worst day of her life would be seared in her memory forever. The town of Carnation has never been the same since. People there likely still whisper about what happened in the big house up the road, where the mobile home and storage shed still stand. So what do you think of this case? Did the perpetrators deserve the death penalty for their horrific actions, or is life without parole an appropriate punishment?
Whenever I went in there, Some of them was laying there in the house dead, blood running every way.
And it was a very horrible scene. And now, this is their loved ones. I mean, imagine the shock and horror that they have.
Christmas is a time for joy, family, and togetherness, but it became a day of unspeakable horror for one North Carolina family in 1929. On December 25th, Charlie Lawson, a well-respected farmer in Germantown, shattered the holiday spirit forever when he brutally murdered his wife and 6 children. This then begs the question, what drove Charlie to commit such a monstrous act? Was it financial strain, madness, or something far more sinister? Stay tuned as we unravel the disturbing mystery behind the Lawson family murders, a tragedy that continues to haunt the small town of Germantown. Charles Davis Lawson, also known as Charlie Lawson, was born on May 10th in 1886 to Augustus and Nancy Lawson. The family lived in Lawsonville, where Lawson would later meet his wife, Franny Manring. Franny and Lawson got married in 1911 and went on to have 8 children. Unfortunately, their third child, a son named William, passed away when he was only 6 years old in 1920 due to pneumonia. The surviving children were 17-year-old Marie, 16-year-old Arthur, 12-year-old Carrie, 7-year-old Maybelle, 4-year-old James, 2-year-old Raymond, and 3-month-old Marilou. 7 years after he got married, Lawson moved his entire family to Germantown, a small town in North Carolina that to this day has a population of less than 1,000 people wanting to be close to his family. Lawson's 2 younger brothers, Elijah and Marion, lived in Germantown with their families and had paved the way for tobacco farming. Lawson began working as a sharecropper until he managed to accumulate enough money to buy a small piece of land for his family on Brook Cove Road. This land was right next to his brothers, which gave the family the much-needed family time that they had desired before moving to Germantown. He would work at the fields in the morning, and by evenings he would rebuild the tobacco barn along with Franny and their 2 older children, Marie and Arthur. One day while working inside the tobacco barn, Lawson had an accident with a piece of rotten timber and an axe. After his head injury, people around him began to notice changes in Lawson's personality. Although he was always known to have a temper, Lawson's anger outbursts not only got worse but also became more frequent. Perhaps this injury was what caused Lawson to kill his entire family a few years later. The Lawson family was known to be nice and normal in all the ways that mattered. Right before Christmas of 1929, the Lawsons had a particularly good tobacco harvest, which is why it was not odd when Lawson took his family shopping in Winston-Salem, another city in North Carolina that was about 20 kilometers away from Germantown. Just 2 weeks away from Christmas, no one thought that it was out of the ordinary for the family to go shopping. Since it was the beginning of the Great Depression, it was not normal for working-class families to openly shop. This would only make sense if Lawson had premeditated the murders and was not thinking long-term. It was reported that Lawson had also told his family that the shopping was all part of a big Christmas surprise for the family. Lawson also took things one step further when he took the family to get a family portrait. Once again, this was uncommon and unheard of among working-class families, as it was a bit expensive. The family portrait itself was a bit strange, with Marie standing next to Lawson, looking angry and upset at something. To her left, Lawson looks smug, while Franny looks worried. To this day, no one knows the circumstances surrounding the strange family portrait. 2 weeks later, on December 25th, 1929, Lawson and his oldest son, Arthur, went out rabbit hunting, a tradition that was followed every Christmas by the people in Germantown. This would also explain why no one was alarmed at the sound of shooting later that day. At the same time, his daughter, Marie, baked a 2-tiered cake and carefully decorated it with icing and raisins. By the time the 2 of them reached their hunting spot, Arthur realized that they did not have ammunition. He then asked Lawson if he had any ammunition, but was told that there were no bullets left. After Lawson sends Arthur to fetch more bullets from the market, he begins his massacre. To this day, No one knows why Arthur was sent away. Why did Lawson decide to keep his oldest son alive? Was it merely a coincidence, or carefully premeditated because he thought that Arthur might have been able to stop him? Maribel and Carrie, who were on their way to their uncle's house to wish them a Merry Christmas, went through the tobacco barn, unaware that their father was hiding inside, waiting for them. As soon as the two of them passed by the barn, Lawson shot them with a 12-gauge shotgun. Although he managed to kill both of the girls, he waited for a bit before going back to them and bludgeoning them to make sure that they were really dead. He then went towards the house where 37-year-old Franny was sitting on the front porch steps, cutting potatoes. Lawson shot her in the chest once, killing her instantly. Hearing the commotion outside, Marie, who was still inside the house, started screaming and managed to tell her younger brothers, James and Raymond, to hide. However, Lawson shot Marie in the chest as well and killed her. He then went on to find the two younger boys and shot them dead as well. Things went from bad to worse when Lawson went up to the bedroom where 3-month-old Marilou lay in her crib. He bludgeoned her to death with the shotgun. It was reported that she died from a fractured skull. Since hunting was common during Christmas, no one arrived at the crime scene right away, giving Lawson a chance to escape along with the family's dogs. He headed into the woods outside of the house and circled around a dogwood tree, until hours later he finally turned the gun on himself and took his own life. Arthur, who was still buying ammunition, heard about the murders and rushed home only to discover a complete bloodbath. It was Lawson's younger brother Elijah and his 2 sons who discovered the bodies. Lawson had laid all of the bodies in front of the farmhouse with their arms crossed over their chest and rocks underneath their heads acting as pillows. The bodies seemed to be casket-ready since everyone was wearing the new clothes that Lawson had bought them just 2 weeks earlier.
Killed them all in the house there, but 2 girls. And then he shot them right there at the barn and drug them in the barn and put rocks on their heads. Now, a man's bound to be crazy to do things like that, you know. I don't believe I could do nothing like that with my family, because unless you was crazy or something bad wrong.
Since Germantown was a small town, it was not long until the entire community showed up at the Lawson household. While the community was still grappling with the harrowing crime scene in front of them, a loud gunshot was heard from the woodland nearby. A police officer along with Arthur rushed into the woods, only to find that Lawson had shot himself. His body was surrounded by letters addressed to his parents. However, the letters failed to identify the motive of his crimes. There were also 2 tobacco auction receipts found in Lawson's pocket with unfinished notes on them. One of the receipts said "trouble can cause," and the other one said "nobody to blame."
He shot himself over in the woods. He carried him a stick and turned the gun right towards his heart and shot himself right in the heart.
It was a horror story. I mean, it was a national story. It made the front page of the New York Times, so it was more than just a local story.
It reportedly snowed anywhere from 6 to 8 inches that day, which is why it was easy to discern that Lawson had walked around the dogwood tree as there was a patch of snow missing from the area, likely contemplating his next move. The Lawson family home was located on top of the hill, which made it harder to get the bodies down. Bed sheets were borrowed from the Lawson household to create makeshift sleds. The bodies were then dragged down the hill and taken to Walnut Cove Funeral House. However, since the town had a very small population, it was not surprising that the funeral home was not equipped to handle 8 bodies at once. The bodies were then transported to Madison Newton's funeral parlor on Murphy Street. The autopsies for all 8 bodies were conducted by Dr. C.J. Hasselbeck, who was the Stokes County coroner. He, along with Dr. Spotswood Taylor, a pathologist who worked at Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, spent the entire night working together. Dr. Taylor, who was home for the Christmas holidays, decided to remove Lawson's brain from his head for further examination and placed it in a jar of preserved formaldehyde, a medical preservative. His reasoning for this was to examine the brain closely to see if any abnormalities would provide some insight into why Lawson had decided to go on a rampage. They discovered that although his brain was smaller than usual and the center part of it was underdeveloped, there were no abnormalities that stood out, or at least anything that would provide an explanation for his behavior. What makes things worse is that the entire Lawson family was buried together, so the victims were buried right next to their murderer. There were 7 graves because 3-month-old Marilou was buried in her mother's arms. The headstone inscription said, "Not now, but in the coming years. It will be in a better land. We'll read the meaning of our tears, and then sometime we'll understand." The news of the murders had taken the community by surprise, and it attracted tons of attention, as even the New York Times published a front-page article with a headline reading, "Stokes Farmer Kills Wife and 6 Children." People from all over the country drove up to attend the funeral. Over 5,000 people were in attendance, and the cars were lined as far as 4 kilometers down the block. Just 10 days after the funeral, Lawson's brother Marion opened the house to the public as a tourist attraction. Right away, he built a fence around the house. Although Marion experienced some pushback as people thought that it was morbid of him to cash off his family's murder, however, he justified it by saying that Arthur needed money to pay the mortgage on the house. True to his word, Marion charged 25 cents per person to walk through the bloodied murder scene. Nothing in the crime scene had been changed or moved around, including Marilou's bloody crib. People took a strange fascination towards the crime scene and even decided to take souvenirs. The house got 500 visitors a day due to the fact that Marion had put up ads in the newspaper that drew even more attention towards the Lawson family house. It was speculated that a man named John Dillinger, a well-known mobster who had escaped prison, made a stop at the house as well. He even left a note for the police to find, mocking them for their incompetence. As the house continued to attract visitors, someone decided to bring in a jar to collect Franny's blood from the front porch stairs. Bricks from the fireplace where Marie had died were also taken as souvenirs. The dogwood tree's bark that Lawson had died in front of had been stripped bare since people collected the bark as memorabilia. The last straw was people picking off the raisins from the cake Marie had baked on Christmas morning for her family. Marion then encased the cake in a glass container to stop people from taking pieces from the cake. The infamous cake remained on display for a long time. There are several conflicting reports that state that Marion buried the cake in front of the house when it was demolished, while others claim that Arthur went back to the house and took the cake with him. However, there is not enough evidence to prove that this happened. Some speculated that the cake that was displayed was replaced along with the raisins on it. By the end of January 1930, the family's belongings were auctioned off. From their clothes to the bloody crib and the murder weapon, everything was sold off. In fact, the murder weapons were sold for a large sum of money. After the auction, Marion set up a tent and sold off the last of the memorabilia of the Lawson family. Arthur chose to not publicly comment on anything regarding his family's murder. However, in an unfortunate turn of events in 1945, a 31-year-old Arthur was involved in a freak accident and passed away, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. The Lawson family house as well as the tobacco barn were demolished. Years later, people reported seeing ghosts of children running around the farmland, while others reported seeing Lawson's ghost around the dogwood tree. Although there is no proof of whether this is true, some claim that in autumn the leaves fall everywhere except for around the circular area where Lawson had paced before turning the gun on himself. The same thing was reported when it started snowing everywhere else except for the circular area. It seems that everyone decided to profit from the family's tragedy as Madison Newton's Funeral Parlor, which had changed its name to Madison Dry Goods in downtown Madison, decided to open up the upstairs mortuary for the public. The owners, Richard and Kathy Miller, decided to restore the original mortuary and even put up signed pictures of the Lawson family. The tragedy remained popular and had books, poems, and even songs written about it. One popular song called The Murder of the Lawson Family by Carolina Buddies gained traction and sold more than 8,000 units, which was a huge number as the Great Depression was beginning to set in. 2 notable books were published, one in 1990 by a father and daughter duo, Trudy J. Smith and M. Bruce Jones, called White Christmas, Bloody Christmas, and the other book was published in 2006 called The Meaning of Our Tears by Trudy J. Smith. Several theories flew around with people trying to speculate about Lawson's motive. However, only a few seemed plausible. One theory claimed that Lawson had witnessed an organized crime incident. This is why he, along with the rest of his family, was killed, but made to seem like a murder-suicide case. Another theory hypothesized that Lawson had developed a medical condition due to his incident with the axe. However, this theory was quickly debunked because Johns Hopkins Medical Center did not find any abnormalities in his brain that would explain his erratic behavior. It is not far-fetched to think that autopsies in that day and age were not as thorough as they are today, hence something could have been missed. Lawson's brain cannot be examined again due to the fact that it is very old and was not as well preserved as one would hope. One theory, which is one that is widely believed since there is some evidence to back this up, is that Marie was sexually assaulted by her father and had gotten pregnant as a result. This theory did not come out until 1990, when the book White Christmas, Bloody Christmas was published. The author interviewed a relative of the Lawson family named Stella Lawson, who was the daughter of Jettie Lawson. Jettie was Charlie Lawson's sister, but had died in 1928. Stella reported that she had heard some of the older women in her family talking about the fact that Franny had been worried about an incestuous relationship between her husband and daughter Marie. Since Jettie passed away a year before the murders, there was no way to confirm or deny these rumors. In the book The Meaning of Our Tears, Trudy J. Smith interviewed Ella May, a good friend of Marie Lawson. Ella reported that Marie had told her friends during a sleepover that she was pregnant with her father's child, and that her mother knew about it as well. Another testimony came from Sam Hill, a close friend and neighbor of the Lawson family, who claimed that the Lawsons were going through some serious troubles and that fights between Franny and Lawson had become more frequent. He also revealed that Lawson had threatened Marie and told her that if she exposed their relationship, there would be some killing done. Although the autopsies did not report any pregnancies, there can be several explanations for it, including the fact that the coroner could have hidden some of his findings to protect the family from more shame. Another explanation could be that the standard autopsy procedure at the time did not involve checking for potential pregnancies. There is no sure-shot way of knowing whether Marie was pregnant, because even if she was, it was probably too early in the pregnancy to tell anything. This theory could also not be pursued further, because by the time DNA sampling became common, Marie's body was far too old and decomposed to be able to tell anything. Since the coffins used were of lower quality as well, none of the bodies were preserved well enough for them to exhume them. This also brings us to the last theory, that Lawson found himself so deep in his financial problems that he decided to take out his entire family so that they could be together after death. After all, how can you explain why someone would kill a 3-month-old child? This is also plausible since the Great Depression had been setting in, and it affected working-class families, such as the Lawsons, the most. What do you think drove Charlie Lawson to murder his entire family? What theory seems the most likely motive? Do you think Marie Lawson knew something sinister was about to happen?